What happens when a legendary martial artist and Hollywood icon sits down for what should be a routine late-night interview, only to discover the host has prepared an ambush designed to humiliate him on national television tonight? What have into the explosive confrontation that had security rushing onto the Jimmy Kimmel live set, and why Chuck Norris walked away from what became the most controversial interview in late-night history. This is a story about respect, dignity, and what occurs when a talk show host crosses a boundary that must never be violated. Make sure to press that subscribe button and leave a comment below, because this tale will leave you wondering everything you thought you knew about late-night TV. Chuck Norris stepped out onto the Jimmy Kimmel live stage with his typical cool confidence, the kind produced by decades of martial arts discipline and Hollywood achievement. The audience exploded in applause, truly enthused at seeing the action star who had become a cultural phenomenon. He got into the guest chair, adjusting his jacket with military precision. "Chuck Norris, everybody," Jimmy said, his trademark grin spreading across his face. "Thanks for being here, Chuck." "Thanks for having me, Jimmy," Chuck said, his voice steady and respectful. "So, Chuck, I have to ask," Jimmy started, leaning forward with an expression that seemed amiable but had an undertone Chuck couldn't quite define. "You know, there are all these Chuck Norris facts floating around the internet. Things like Chuck Norris counted to infinity twice, or Chuck Norris can divide by zero. What do you think about becoming this internet meme?" Chuck nodded thoughtfully. "Well, Jimmy, I think it's flattering that people have had fun with my image. Some of them are quite creative. My family enjoys them, right?" "Right," Jimmy said, but his smile had taken on different quality. "But here's what I'm curious about. Do you ever worry that these jokes have kind of turned you into parody of yourself? I mean, when was the last time you actually did anything that lived up to the Chuck Norris legend?" The question hung in the air. Like a challenge, Chuck's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture, a subtle straightening that anyone who knew martial arts would recognize as a readiness position. "I'm not certain I get the question," Jimmy Chuck replied, flat out. "Well, I mean," Jimmy went on, his voice adopting a mock innocent tone, "you're famous for being this tough guy, but you're what, 80 years old? Now you do infomercials for exercise equipment. You haven't produced a real movie in years, don't you think? Perhaps it's time to own up to the fact that the Chuck Norris mystique is a mystique." The audience had gone decidedly quieter. Chuck studied Jimmy's face for quite some time before answering. "Jimmy, I've had a long life career doing what I love. I've been graciously blessed to entertain people, to instruct martial arts, and to serve my country. I don't need to prove anything to anyone now at this point in my life." But that's the thing. Jimmy pushed, and now his tone was outright confrontational. "You've created this entire persona on being unbeatable, invincible. But what if you really did that so special? I mean, Bruce Lee was a philosopher and changed the face of martial arts. Jackie Chan performs his own stunts well into his 60s. Steven Seagal. Well, okay, maybe Steven Seagal isn't an ideal example." The audience laughed nervously at Jimmy's aside, but Chuck wasn't smiling. "What exactly are you trying to get at here, Jimmy?" Chuck asked, his voice still controlled, but with an edge that hadn't been present before. "I'm just saying," Jimmy went on, spreading his hands, as if he were acting rationally. "Perhaps it's time to have a straight talk about the difference between the Chuck Norris mythos and the Chuck Norris reality. I mean, you were a pretty mediocre action star during the 80s and 90s. You did some TV, you did some karate tournaments back in the day, but for some reason you've become this larger-than-life legend. And I'm questioning whether you've begun believing your own press." Chuck was being silent for a few seconds, and the studio audience appeared to have a sense that something had essentially changed in the temperature when he talked. His voice was lower than previously, but it also had more authority. "Jimmy, I wanted to come here tonight to have a discussion with you regarding my career, my family, perhaps tell some tales. To your readers, I did not come here to be disrespected." Jimmy made a laugh, but it sounded strained now. "Chuck, I'm just asking questions. Isn't that what interviews are for? Or do you only conduct interviews where folks kiss and hug your ring and act as if you really are superhuman? Can I get some difference between asking questions and attempting to teach someone down to benefit your own amusement?" Chuck retorted, his martial arts training apparent in the way, utterly motionless he just remained. What you're doing now, this is not journalism. This is not even decent television. This is only just mean-spirited. Jimmy's smile was becoming more and more forced to come on, Chuck. You can't take a little aggressive questioning. What happened to the guy who's tougher than nails? Are you going to bawl? Should I get you a tissue? The sneer in Jimmy's voice was unmistakable now, and a few audience members actually gasped. Chuck slowly turned to face Jimmy straight on, and for the first time since the interview started, Jimmy seemed to become aware he might have gone too far. You know what, Jimmy? Chuck said, his tone exactly calm, but with an unmistakable note of finality. I've been in this business for more than 40 years. I've worked with professionals and I've worked with amateurs. I've been spoken to by journalists who ask difficult questions because they want to educate their audience. And I've been spoken to people who ask difficult questions because they want to make themselves look clever at the expense of their guests. And which one am I? Jimmy asked. But his cockiness was beginning to crack. You tell me, said Chuck, is this how you treat all your guests, or did you choose to make an exception for me tonight? The tension within the studio was palpable now. Even the band looked ill at ease, and the audience had gone nearly completely quiet, sensing that they were witnessing something that had gone far beyond late-night cleverness. Jimmy shifted restlessly in his seat. Seeing the interview had taken a turn he hadn't entirely expected, but instead of backing off, he doubled up his ego, seemingly unable to let Chuck have the last word. Look, Chuck, Jimmy said, attempting to take back the conversation. I think you're getting a little touchy. Here, this is comedy. This is what we Dow roast. We ask the tough questions. We keep things on the edge. Maybe you're just not used to being pushed. Chuck's eyes slit ever so slightly. Push, Jimmy. I've been pushed by rivals in the ring who would shatter bones with their naked fists. I've been tested by producers who insisted on perfection in death. Defying stunts, I've been tested by life in ways you likely can't conceive. What you're doing is not real testing for me. You're attempting to embarrass me for cheap publicity embarrassment. You, Jimmy sneered. Come on, Chuck. You're a public figure you've made millions off. This image of the tough guy, don't you think the public has a right to know what's hiding the curtain? I mean, let's face it here. When was the last time you were in an actual fight? And I don't mean some choreographed movie stunt or exhibition match. I'm talking about an actual fight. The question was obviously meant to try to get a reaction out of someone. And Chuck knew it for what it was. His voice didn't shake, but there was steel in it. Now, are you asking me to prove myself to you, Jimmy? Because if that's what this is about, we can get this over with right here and right now. The audience gasped collectively, and Jimmy's eyes went wide for a second. The host sort of realized he was no longer in charge of things. Whoa, Chuck, Jimmy stated, holding up his hands and laughing. I'm not trying to fight you. I'm just saying maybe it's time to acknowledge that the whole Chuck Norris mystique is just marketing, just show business. There's nothing wrong with that. Most of Hollywood is smoke and mirrors. So you think I'm all smoke and mirrors? Chuck asked softly. I think you're a smart businessman who figured out how to make a humble martial art career into a brand, said Jimmy, back, his confidence restored because he felt he was on firmer ground. And hey, more power to you, but let's not pretend you're actually the superhero these internet memes make you out to be. Chuck said nothing for a long time regarding Jimmy, with the kind of fierce concentration that had served him so well in so many competitions. When he finally did speak, his voice was quietly dangerous. Jimmy, let me ask you something. Do you know what respect means? Of course I know what respect means, Jimmy replied offhandedly. I don't think you do, Chuck went on, because if you did, you'd realize that respect isn't something you get for just having a television show. It's something you demonstrate to other people, especially when they're guests in your home. This is my show. Chuck. Jimmy snapped back his mask of friendliness. Now shed completely, this is my home, and I'll ask all the questions I want to ask. If you don't want it, you can leave. Is that what you want? You want me to leave? I want you to tell me the truth for once. Remember, instead of hiding behind this mythical warrior ploy, Jimmy said, leaning forward menacingly, I want you to own up to the fact that Chuck Norris, the legend, is only a character you act, and Chuck Norris, the man, is only another middle-aged actor. Trying to remain current, the silence that subsequently followed was deafening. Chuck gazed at Jimmy for what seemed like forever, then slowly arose from his seat. The action was so smooth and restrained that it appeared almost choreographed, but everyone in the studio knew the pent-up power beneath it. "You know what, Jimmy?" Chuck declared, his voice ringing throughout the now totally quiet studio. "You're right on one count. Chuck Norris, the legend, is different from Chuck Norris. The man, the legend, never gets mad. The legend never loses his temper. The legend is always cool and calm. No matter what." Jimmy swallowed hard all of a sudden, very conscious of how much bigger Chuck was now that he was standing. "But Chuck Norris, the man," Chuck went on. "Chuck Norris, the man, has lived his whole life learning discipline, respect, and honor. And Chuck Norris, the man, does not take kindly to being insulted by a person who believes having a late-night television appearance makes him tough." "Chuck, have a seat," Jimmy insisted, attempting to put authority in his voice, but coming up short. "You're making this uncomfortable for everyone." "I'm making this uncomfortable," Chuck laughed, but there was no laughter in it. "Jimmy, you had me over as your guest, then spent the whole time attempting to rip me apart. You've been condescending, unprofessional, and quite embarrassing, and now you're asking me. I'm making things awkward. Look, if you can't cope, a little ribbing." "Perhaps you shouldn't be doing interviews," Jimmy said, but his voice had lost much of its authority. "A little ribbing," Chuck repeated. "Jimmy, there's a difference between friendly banter and what you've been doing tonight. What you've been doing is making an effort to humiliate a guest for your own amusement, and the worst thing is you do seem to think you're entitled to do it just because this is your show." Jimmy opened his mouth to answer, but Chuck wasn't done. "Let me tell you something about respect, Jimmy. In the martial arts, we have something that we call honor. It means you treat your adversaries with dignity, even if you're fighting them. It means you don't attempt to win by dissing the other guy down. You attempt to win by building yourself up. But you wouldn't get that, would you? Because everything that this," Chuck waved his arm around the studio, "is about dissing people on the floor, laughing. This is entertainment." "Chuck," Jimmy replied weakly, "people watch in order to see celebrities be grilled. It's what they come to expect." "No, Jimmy," Chuck responded, shaking his head. "This is bullying, and the fact that you can't discern the difference tells me everything I need to know about your character." The camera crew members were plainly in doubt as to whether to continue rolling, and the audience sat in shocked silence as the altercation escalated beyond anything they had anticipated from a usual late-night show interview. His face had paled, but his pride would not let him back down entirely. He forced a quivering laugh and glanced towards his audience, as though looking for backup. "Okay, Chuck, I think you're reacting too strongly here," Jimmy said in an attempt to recapture some semblance of control. "Such is the way late-night television functions. We joke, we have fun. We don't take everything so darn seriously. Maybe you've been away from show business too long, and you've forgotten how this works." Chuck moved a step closer to Jimmy's desk, and the host shifted instinctively back in his chair. "Let me make something very clear to you, Jimmy," Chuck said, his voice low and measured. "I haven't forgotten anything about show business. I remember when entertainers had class. I remember when hosts treated their guests with basic human decency. What I'm seeing here tonight isn't show business. It's a sad little man trying to build himself up by tearing others down." "Now wait just a minute," Jimmy said, his voice coming up as his own anger finally started to appear. "You don't get to come on my show and lecture me on how to do my job. I've been doing it for years. I've interviewed everyone from presidents to pop stars, and they all knew that this comes with the territory." "The territory," Chuck repeated, his eyebrows coming up. "What territory is that?" "Jimmy, the territory where you can be a bully because you have a microphone. The domain where you get to make fun of people because they're sitting in the guest chair. I'm not making fun of you. I'm asking valid questions about your career and your image," Jimmy complained, but his tone wasn't sincere. "No, Jimmy, you're not asking valid questions. You want to know what a valid question sounds like. A valid question would be, Chuck, how did you cross over from martial arts competition to Hollywood? Or, Chuck, what would you say to young martial artists beginning? Or even, Chuck, what do you think of the internet memes people have made about you?" Chuck sat for a moment, allowing his words to seep in before going on. "But that's not what you asked, is it? Instead, you asked me of my achievements. You ridiculed my age. You assumed I was a fake, and you attempted to get me to prove myself to you like some sort of trained animal who's not journalism. Jimmy, that's harassment. Jimmy's producer was wildly waving from offstage, obviously attempting to convey that this had gone too far. But Jimmy was oblivious to all else except his bruised pride. Look, Chuck, if you can't stand the heat, get out of the kitchen, Jimmy said, resorting to a cliche. This is television. This is entertainment. If you wanted to be treated with kid gloves, you should have done the interview with Ellen. The mention of Ellen appeared to be the last thing Chuck could take. His expression hardened. And when he spoke, his voice was with the kind of authority that comes with decades of discipline and self-control. You know what, Jimmy? You're completely right. If I wanted to be treated with respect, I should have gone somewhere else, because clearly respect is something you don't understand and don't practice. Chuck started to pull away his microphone, his movements slow and purposeful, controlled. Whoa, Chuck, what are you doing? Jimmy demanded suddenly, coming to the realization that his guest was about to depart. I'm doing what I should have done 10 minutes back, Chuck answered coolly. I'm getting out of this poisonous environment. You can't leave in the middle of an interview, Jimmy exclaimed, panic creeping into his tone as he noticed his show going down the drain on live TV. Watch me, Chuck stated sternly. Chuck, come on, don't be so sensitive. Jimmy begged, but it was too late. We're merely having a discussion here. This is good TV. Chuck turned to regard Jimmy one last time, and his face was one of utter disappointment instead of rage. Jimmy, this isn't good TV. This is a train wreck. And the most depressing part is that you don't even realize it. You think embarrassing your guests makes you clever, but all it does is make you appear small. Small. Jimmy's voice broke lightly on the word. Small Chuck confirmed small and insecure and desperate for attention. You know, I've met a great many people in my lifetime. Jimmy, I've met heroes and I've met cowards. I've met champions and I've met cheaters. But I don't think I've ever met anyone who was so desperate to show they were tough that they'd attack a guest on their own show. Jimmy stood up from behind his desk, his face flushed with embarrassment and anger. You're better than me, Jimmy yelled. You think because you know karate, you can come on my show and insult me? I don't think I'm better than you, Jimmy, Chuck said dejectedly. I just think I'm better than this. Security personnel then started moving towards the stage, obviously having been called by the more and more panicked producers, but Chuck raised his hand, halting them in their tracks. No need for security, Chuck said, smiling. I'm walking away. Just like some folks I know when to walk. Fine, just go ahead and walk out, Jimmy said, his voice trembling with humiliation. Run away like the coward you truly are. Chuck stopped at the edge of the stage and turned back once more. The studio was so hushed you could hear a pin drop. Jimmy, Chuck said, his voice ringing happily throughout the quiet studio. I've been called many names in my life. Have been referred to as hard. I've been referred to as disciplined. I've been referred to as determined. I've even been referred to as stubborn, demanding, and sometimes hard to work with. But in 40 years of show business until tonight, I had never once been referred to as a coward. Congratulations, you were the first to accomplish that. Chuck Norris stormed off the Jimmy Kimmel live set, leaving a host whose face had turned completely white, an audience sitting in stunned silence. In a TV moment that would be discussed for years to come, Jimmy stood behind his desk, microphone in hand, obviously having no idea of how to recover from what had just happened. The cameras kept rolling, filming every moment of his humiliation, as he understood that his effort at embarrassing Chuck Norris had backfired spectacularly. Well, Jimmy finally brought himself to say, his voice barely above a whisper, I guess that's a Chuck Norris, everybody. But the damage was done. The interview that was meant to highlight Jimmy's humor and interviewing abilities had instead made him come across as just what Chuck had labeled him, a bully who had finally bullied the wrong individual. And that's how Chuck Norris got kicked off of Jimmy Kimmel's show. Except he wasn't kicked off whatsoever. He walked off with his dignity still in place, leaving Jimmy to deal with the repercussions of his own poor choice. What do you think? Did Chuck deal with this situation the proper way? Or should he have remained and resumed the battle drop? Your comments in the space below, and don't forget to subscribe to that button for more stories like this one.